Protests against racial injustice and police brutality are taking the United States by storm. Demonstrators across the country are calling for police reforms and demanding justice for those who have fallen victim to discriminatory practices of the U.S. law enforcement. Tens of thousands of Black Lives Matter protesters hit the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin, the city where African-American Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by a white police officer last week. Elsewhere in Portland, a person was shot dead during a rally as demonstrators from rival groups clashed in the city in the 94th consecutive night of anti-racism protests. The man who was killed was reportedly wearing a hat with the insignia of Patriot Prayer, a far-right group based in Portland that has clashed with the protesters in the past. The incident marked the end of a turbulent week in the U.S. that began after the shooting of Blake. Although he survived, he has become paralyzed from the waist down as a result of the injuries he sustained.
This is a country that's based on and sustains itself through inequality, particularly racist inequality and exploitation of the working class. And so some of those things, even some of the more, there are some of those things that happen that are not as looked at because they don't make the news, so to speak. For example, right now, the COVID-19 pandemic is leveling extreme devastation against black and brown working class people here because there is no human right to health care in the country. Right now, people are being forced back to jobs that the society or this society and the government or the people feel are essential and they can't do without, and they are not being afforded the protection that they need to protect themselves from the pandemic.
The incident has added fresh fuel to protests against police violence and racism across the U.S. A new report about the ties between police and far-right vigilante groups suggests white supremacist groups have infiltrated the U.S. law enforcement across the country in the past 20 years. A former FBI agent says hundreds of American police officers have been caught posting racist and bigoted social media content. His report details incidents where police officers cooperated with far-right extremists against anti-racism activists and protesters. Recent racially charged incidents have intensified concerns regarding alleged ties between the American police and white supremacists. Activists in Kenosha say the police responded to the protests in the city with violence but did little to stop white armed vigilantes who clashed with anti-racism demonstrators. The gravity of the issue is such that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and FBI have directly identified white supremacists as the most lethal domestic terrorism threat in the country, whose victims comprise both whites and non-whites.
Organized white supremacy has infiltrated law enforcement at every level. This is the result of their investigation. And law enforcement, not just meaning the police officers who patrol the streets and things like that, but this means the judicial system, the DA, the judges, all of that. That's at every level. And it's not hard to realize that it didn't take much really to infiltrate it, so to speak. You really could just recruit people because this country was founded on white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy.
Meanwhile, issues such as President Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus outbreak, whether to wear a face mask in the public, and how secure voting by mail is amid the pandemic are widening the already existing divisions in the United States. The country has gone through 2 historic instances of Reconstruction. The first followed the 4-year-long Civil War of 1860s, and the other was marked by the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s.
And those types of extreme inequality and extreme repression continued all the way through this day. During the 60s and 70s, there was a program by the FBI called Counterintelligence Program that assassinated leaders in the social justice movements, and particularly in the Black Panther Party, the FBI, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and this Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It had nothing to do with whether groups are violent or not, but anything that threatens the paradigm of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy, what we call the Pan-European project, a white supremacist project, will be attacked by this country.
With a renewed debate on racial discrimination in the country, are we looking at what could turn out to become a second civil war in the US?